Today's daf is daf lamed gimel, and we'll start on the second line, Omer Abai, going into the third line. Now, all we have to know from yesterday's discussion is that when you have a hadas, you could imagine a case, which Gemara has actually a kind of hadas that has 7 leaves going across. Then even if the majority of those leaves fell off, which means out of 7, 4 fell off, you're left with 3. And if you're left with 3, you could have what's called an avos. Avos means that one is on top of the other. So you have 2 leaves and then a third leaf, which goes on top of the other 2 leaves. Now, where do we find such a hadas? Where does it exist that it has actually such a bush, 7 leaves over there? And that's called an asa mitzrah, meaning it's imported from Mitzrayim. We can take this Hoshana, this hadas, we could add an aravos and a lulav and bind it together, and we have ourselves the Hoshana. So the Gemara asks Pshita, why would we think that this Hoshana, because it has extra, what is it called, Mosid Korea, just because it has more leaves, it should be possible? How did Tema hold the Isli Shem Levi? Whenever you have a noun and you add an adjective to that noun, to describe that noun, it becomes a category unto itself. So when you have an arava or a hadas, it's called just that. But in the case of an asa mitzrah, they always add the word mitzrayim, and that is called the shem lefai. It's a descriptive term. And that would set it up as a new category, and it would no longer be a hadas. Mashmalan, and Abai wants to mechadish us that this shem lefai is just a matter of identifying the special, unique characteristics of this hadas, but in no way does it indicate that it's a new min, a separate category. It is a hadas. The Gemara says v'ema hachinami, but how does Abai really know for sure that the additional description of this hadas as an Egyptian hadas is not called a shem levai? Maybe it is called a shem levai, and maybe the fact that people call it by that name indicates that it's a category unto itself. And the Gemara is seeking some sort of a drasha from the Pasuk that would indicate that we could expand the definition of hadas to include even a hadas mitzri. The Gemara answers, "Eitz avos of Rachmana mikol makom." The Torah says you need to take a stem which has leaves in it, and the leaves are piled one on top of the other, so they cover the entire stem. That's called avos. And the Torah doesn't specify that you need anything other than eitz avos, as if to tell me that anything that is eitz avos, if that's the description of the reality, then it's kosher for the mitzvah. Daled meaning, in other words, if the Torah would have been more specific and narrow it down to a certain type of a hadas, a certain type of eitz avos, then maybe you would come to exclude the Egyptian eitz avos. Since the Torah gives you a generic term, eitz avos, describing what it looks like, and certainly this hadas mitzri fits that description, therefore it's included under anaf eitz avos. Tanur Rabbanu, we learned in the Bryce, Yovchu Rov Olam. If most of the leaves of the hadas dried up, the nisharubo shlosha bade olim lachin, but nevertheless you have 3 badim which are still moist, kosher. Now, what does this mean? Nisharubo shlosha bade olim. So we're going to take a look at Rashi. Rashi here on Daf Lamed Gimel is on the 3rd line from the top. Rashi says, Shlosha badim ubechol bad shlosha olim lachim. Rashi is saying the following, that you have three stems, meaning three hadassim, those are called badim, and on each one of these three hadassim, despite the fact that most of the olim, of the leaves have dried up, nevertheless each bad has a minimum of three leaves that are still moist. And once you have three leaves that are left over, you have avos. So you have a hadas, it dried up, but nevertheless you have enough of moist leaves in order to qualify as avos. Because what's the minimum leaves for avos? Three. You need two leaves going this way and a third laying on top. And Omar Rav Chisda qualifies. He limits, says, Uberosh kol echad v'echad. Each one of these stems, each one of these hadassim, has to have the shlosha badim olim lachim on the top. If the dry leaves are on top of the hadas, that's already not considered hadar. That's not beautiful. But if the top leaves, which are the ones that are most apparent to the eye, especially when you take the dal minim, if they're still moist and he's got a minimum of three leaves on top of each one of the three badim, each one of the three hadassim, then Rav Chisda says it's kosher. So this is the way Rashi understood our sugi. The Rosh points out that the language of the Brisa is a bit difficult according to Rashi, because it sounds like the Brisa is talking about a case where he has three badim, according to Rashi. And you can't blame Rashi for that, because the language of the Brisa is Nisharu bo shlosha badim. And also the word Yavshu Rov Olav, the word Olav is written in the singular. Whereas according to Rashi, it's not Olav, it's Olav of each one of three badim. So it should have said Aleim, Yavshu Rov Aleim of these three badim. Therefore, the Rosh postulates against Rashi that we're talking not about three different hadassim, but about one hadas. And most of the leaves on this single hadas dried up, and therefore it says Yavshu Rov Olav in the singular, because we're only talking about one bad or one hadas. And Rav Chisda is teaching us, the Brisa is teaching us, before we get to the qualification of Chisda, that although most of the leaves on this single hadas have dried up, but on three different sections of this hadas, you have moist leaves. So it's not the way Rashi has it, that there's only one cluster of leaves on each one of three badim that remain moist, but rather, according to the Rosh, you have three different clusters, in gatherings or groups of olim on this one single hadas that are moist. So therefore, according to the Rosh, it's not enough to say, well, I have one cluster of three moist leaves to be machshir the entire hadas. That's Rashi. The Rosh requires a minimum of three different groups of, or clusters of olim lachim in order for the hadas to qualify.
So when it says Bade Ali, but Bade are not three different
Hadassim, but rather three different clusters on that one. And he builds himself on the fact that it says Yavshu Rov Olav. We must be talking about one hadas, which according to Rashi, we talk about three hadassim. Who says that he's talking about a case of three hadassim?
How do you translate bade?
So that depends on Rashi and the Rosh. According to the Rashi, Badim means the entire stem, what we call a Hadas. So he's got 3 Hadasim, and that's called Shlosha Badim Olim Lachem, meaning there are Olim Lachem on each one of these 3 Badim. And Rashi says, how many Olim Lachem are there on each one of these 3 Badim? A minimum of 3. But they're all coming from the same spot. The Rosh is much more machmir. He requires that there be shlosha badim on each one of the hadasim, and we're talking about 1 hadas. And the Bryce is telling us that if Yavshu rove olav of 1 hadas, then you could still maintain the kashrus of the hadas, but only on the condition that you have 3 bade olim lachem. And a bad of olim lachem means 3 olive. So you've got 1 bad, another bad, another bad, because the Russian interprets the word bad as a cluster of leaves, not as a stem. The Mishnah says that Niktam Rosho, if you chopped off the head of the Hadas, then it's possible. So the Gemara now quotes Tani Ula Bar Chinun, a brisa that was brought down by Ula. Niktam Rosho, the also bow tomorrow, kosher. This is unbelievable. What happens is you cut down the top of Hadas, and this spontaneous generation, so to speak. What happens is that the Hadas is going to produce a tamar. It's literally a date. Something's going to grow on the top of the Hadas, and it covers over, so to speak, the part of the Hadas that was cut. You follow? You can't even see that it was cut because there's a Tamara that grew out of the top of this Hadas. And this statement of the Bryce of Ula is going to occupy our minds, because what's happening is here, like we're getting into a very, very famous sugya, which is called Dichui. Dichui means that you have a chefetz shel mitzvah, and it was once possible. Can it become kosher? And in kachim, there's halacha called Dichui. Dichui means that once the carbon was disqualified, then it can never again become qualified. It's been rejected by the Mizbeach for whatever reason. Let's say it was damaged, and then you fixed it up. Too late, buddy. That's called dichui b'karbanos. The question is that a unique halacha karbanos, or is that simply indicative of all cheftzei mitzvah? And here we seem to have a position in this brisa that ain't dichui b'mitzvahs. That even though at one moment in time the hadas was certainly possible, had you taken it before the Torah had grown, it would certainly undermine your mitzvah. But nevertheless, now says the Bryce of Ula, if it grew a tamar, it goes back to becoming kosher. I shouldn't say go back to becoming kosher, because in truth it never was kosher. Well, no, that's not true. It was kosher before it got cut. Then it became possible when it got cut, and now it goes back to its original position being kosher, because also about tomorrow. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah wanted to know the following: Niktam Rosho may erev yontif be also about tomorrow be yontif ma'u. What happens in a case where it got cut down before yontif? So when the sun set on the night of the 15th of Tishrei and ushered in Yontif, we had a Osula Hadas. Now, by the time he wakes up the next morning, on the 15th of Tishrei, lo and behold, also about tomorrow. Wow, yesh dichri yetzel mitzvahs? Olo. Do we accept the principle of dichri with regard to mitzvahs? And therefore, since at the moment of entering into Yontif, when the mitzvah begins, at least in potential. I mean, the Kedush Hayom of that mitzvah has already emerged with nightfall of the 15th. And now we have in front of us a Hadas that's possible. Tomorrow in the morning, also Tamra became Kachim. So shouldn't we say Yesh Tichli El Tzom Mitzvah? It's just like in Kachim, once it was disqualified, it remains disqualified, even if you remove the original cause of the disqualification. So too in mitzvahs, once it became disqualified, even if you remove the disqualification, because it was also Batamra, it remains possible. Once you're possible, you're out of the, you're kicked out of the league, so to speak, and we won't accept you again.
Why do you compare a mitzvah korban?
Because basically a korban is a prime example of a chefetz shel mitzvah. What is a korban if not a chefetz shel mitzvah? The Torah says you designated this as a korban, it's sanctified. Now bring it on the mizbeach. That makes it into a prime example of a chefetz shel mitzvah. And we have a principle in the Torah, binyan av. If we found in Kodshim that the chefetz shel mitzvah in tzvachim is possible once there's dichui, the same thing should apply to any chefetz shel mitzvah. Or do we say no? It's a separate din because of hegdesh. We have many, many unique dinim in hegdesh that have no application or no mirror image in the world of mitzvah. In fact, just to remind you, Reish Lakish, this was the note of Yehuda we spoke about 2 days ago. Reish Lakish is of the opinion that there's no psul mitzvah bava avera except for kachim. Right? You remember that the source for mitzvah bava avera was a poskim malachi that was referring to kachim or banos. Only in korbanos is there psul mitzvah bava avera. The Torah ups the ante, and the demands and the requirements of korban are that much greater because the kedusha of the korban. Kedusha saguf. Is an Isur Me'ilah. We don't find Me'ilah in any mitzvah whatsoever. There's only Me'ilah in Karbanos. So therefore, lo. That's the second side in Rabbi Yirmiyah's Safek, that the principle of Dichui only applies to Kodshim and not beyond Kodshim. So that was the Safek of Rabbi Yirmiyah. So the Gemara says, I don't know why Rabbi Yirmiyah had to rack his brains over this question. It's explicit in the Mishnah. Now, you know that there's a mitzvah called Kisi Adam. The sugya, the Mishnah of Kisi Adam is a Masechet Chulin. And the question is, when you shech, let's say a chaya or an oaf, you have to cover its dam. But what happens if before you got a chance to cover the dam, the wind blew the dust and covered the dam? So at that point, the mitzvah of Kitzi Adam is completely terminated. Then another wind came from the opposite direction and blew away the dust, and now the dam was exposed again. Kiso v'nisgala potami lechasos kiso ruach chayav lechasos. Here are the two cases. If he himself, after he shechted the bird, he covered its dam, and then a wind came and exposed the dam and blew away the dust that was covering the dam, then the halach is he's potter. Why? Because the mitzvah of this dam is a one-time mitzvah. Dam, the same exact dam, could never be machayv twice. Once you fulfill your mitzvah, shalom al Yisrael. However, what happens if you didn't fulfill the mitzvah, but rather the ruach came and covered the dam, and then subsequently, it got exposed. As long as the dam was covered as a result of the wind, there was no mitzvah of Kisi Adam. Does that mean that the mitzvah of Kisi Adam was fulfilled? No, there is no mitzvah of Kisi Adam. There's no dam that's machayv. It's covered. But now the wind blew away the dust, and the dam is now uncovered again. And the Mishnah says, the Omar Rabba Bar Bachana Rav Yochanan Lo Shanu El Shechazar V'Nisgala Aval Lo Chazar V'Nisgala Potem V'Lechasos. He doesn't actively have to expose the dam as long as the dam is covered and it's been concealed as a result of the effort of the wind. In such a case, there is no dam to be mechayev. So he's not actively obligated to jump in and change the reality and expose the dam. But if the wind that covered the dam was also responsible for uncovering the dam, then the mitzvah comes back into vogue and it's b'chayav him and he has to cover it. So that's called chazar v'nisgala is chayav l'chasar. And the Gemara in Masechet Chulin on Daf Pei Zayin raises the following question: Chavinin ba ki chazar v'nisgala my chayav l'chasar. I don't understand, says the Gemara, the underlying principle of this Mishnah that when the wind reveals the dam again, there's a mitzvah that's generated by the dam, and he has to fulfill that mitzvah of covering the dam. Why not apply the principle that once this dam was out of the mitzvah, was out of the realm of the mitzvah, because it was covered, from that point on, it could never become a hefter shel mitzvah. It could never regenerate a mitzvah. The Amar Rav Papa, and Rav Papa commenting on this Mishnah, Zoso Beres, ain't the mitzvahs, the principle that we found with regard to Kodshim, that once the mitzvah is out of the league, it can never be reinstated into the league. That principle is limited to karbanos because of the high standards and demands of karbanos. But with regard to mitzvahs, it could be outside of the realm of the mitzvah, but you remove that cause that rejected the mitzvah. Now you can reinstate the mitzvah and it generate a new chiyuv of the mitzvah. And that's called ein dichayetzel mitzvahs. And the Gemara is so convinced that Rav Papa is right here. There's no other way of explaining why, if the wind went ahead and now re-exposed the dam yochayev in kisud, unless we assume the conclusion and the principle that underlies the Mishnah included is ein dichayetzel mitzvahs. Why did Rabbi Yirmiyah vacillate about this question? It's explicit in the Mishnah. And the Gemara answers, Rav Papa gufe mipoyle. The truth is that Rav Papa himself had a certain diuk from our Mishnah, from the Mishnah included, and Rav Yirmiyah was not absolutely convinced that Rav Papa was correct. Nifshat poshet le'di ein dichayetzel mitzvahs. It may be true that the Mishnah, as Rav Papa insists, is applying the principle of ein dichayetzel mitzvahs. Yeah, but that's not going to solve Rav Yirmiyah's problem. Why? Because it's possible to go to one of two directions. Either the Mishnah holds loshna l'kula v'loshna l'chum. The Mishnah was absolutely convinced that ein dichayetzel mitzvahs, and therefore, if ein dichayetzel mitzvahs, we can even be making, as we'll see in just a second. We can be lenient because it's an absolute, clear, certain decision. O dilma sifuke misafkale. Is it possible that the Mishnah, the Tana of our Mishnah, included, was vacillating about this? Therefore, what do you do in a case of Safek? L'chumra amrinon, l'kula lo amrinon. What that means is that if you're dealing with a question of whether or not you're obligated in a mitzvah like Kisi Adam, then we'll say ein dichayetzel mitzvahs when the wind exposes the dam, you're chayet. That's called l'chumra. But in the case of hadas, you want to fulfill your mitzvah of hadas when hadas was possible, and now also botamra, and it became kosher. Now I'm going to say yesh dichayetzel mitzvahs because I'm always going to go l'chumra, and the Tana is not a proof, says Rabbi Yirmiyah. The Tana is only applying the laws of Sfeikos, and therefore he's machmir. But the Tana would not go as far as to be machshir and qualify a hadas, which was niktam rosho, and then also botamra, based on the principle of ein dichayetzel mitzvahs. Maybe yesh dichayetzel mitzvahs. And Teku, we don't have an answer to this question.
I didn't understand.
No, this okay.
But I can't understand how case of it's not similar to the cutoff.
Because Kisi Adam would be machmir.
What?
We're coming to be machmir. We're saying ain't dichayetzel mitzvahs nefer yechayev in the mitzvah. That's a chumrah. But in a suffix, I can't go l'kula. So therefore, to say that I'm going to be machshir a hadas based on the principle of ein dichayetzel mitzvahs, when ein dichayetzel mitzvahs is a suffix, and it was never actually determined, Here I have to exclude this hadas. Why? Because I have to go l'chumra. So this issue of yesh dichei mitzvahs, ein dichei remains an outstanding question, and we're always going to have to take it l'chumra. If l'chumra means that therefore ein dichei mitzvahs and I'm chayiv in the mitzvah, that's what I'm going to do. And that's the case of Kisei Adam. If ein dichei mitzvahs means that I could be makil, then I can't rely on this principle of ein dichei mitzvahs. I have to assume the worst case scenario that yesh dichei mitzvahs, and therefore this hadas, since it was rejected after the head was chopped off, it cannot go back and be kosher. Shall we assume that this issue of whether this dichei mitzvahs or not is machlokes tanoim? Ovar ulekaton pasul divrei Rabbi Eliezer ben Tzadok v'chachamim machshir. Okay. The Brisa records a machlokes in the case where there were more berries on, and we're talking about black berries, on the hadas than there were leaves, and then he plucked off the berries. Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok says if he did this on Yontiv, then the hadas remains possible, and the Chacham say it's kosher. He took off the berries. Could it be that the issue at stake? Again, I'm giving you a preview of coming attractions, is whether yesh dichei b'mitzvahs. Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok holds that since at one point you had too many berries, that hadas is finito. It's history. It's possible, like we saw in Kachin. And the Chachamim say, no, ain't dichei mitzvahs. This halacha dichei only applies to Kachin. It cannot be extended to apply to mitzvahs. And if you had a psul of row of what? Of row of what's it called? Berries, right? And now anovim, and now you remove the anovim, so you can be machshir. But the Gemara still has a ways to go before we get to that conclusion. I gave you the punchline. Gemara says, "Savrua dekuli amal lulav ein sarach agad." Everybody agrees that lulav does not require agad. If you recall, Rabbi Yehuda was the Tana who required agad, which he derives from a Gzeir Shava to Agudas Ezel. Hold on to that. We'll come back to that. And now, the Gemara is assuming that Rabbi Yehuda was a minority view. Nobody accepted his opinion. Therefore, you don't require egging. You don't require binding it together. Now, if you don't require binding it, the question is how I'm going to say this all in the amount of time that I have. So I'm just going to try my best with this. If you don't follow it, we'll have to have another shir. If you hold lulav tzarach eged, then you have a problem called tasev lo min asid. Why? Because you bind together the hadas. It's got too many berries on it. When you remove the berries, then you didn't make it an asiyah. Asiyah means the act of making an ada. So you can't just remove the berries. You're going to have to take apart all three minim and then after put them together.
You have to bind them together when they're kosher.
Exactly. If you hold lulav tzarach eged, but now the Gemara holds that this price maintains lulav ein tzarach eged. And afilu timsa lomar tzarach eged, the Gemara still has a rabbit in its box over here to pull off. Even if I hold that lulav requires eged, there's still no problem of tasav lo misur. Why? Because lo yalfida lulav misukah. Where does the Torah require an asiyah to build something, create something? That's in Sukkah. It says Shivas Yom Tasu Sukkos. In Lulav, it doesn't say asiyah. And therefore, we don't have a basis for any sort of equation between Lulav and Sukkah. Because Sukkah, Ksiv Beitaseh, you have to create the Sukkah of a Lomin Asli. So let's say you have Pasal Schach. You can't just cut down the Schach, that was Mechubar, and make it into Tolush. You're going to have to take the Schach out and put it back on because the Torah says Tas. But we don't accept any derivation or any equation between Lulav and Sukkah. Therefore, there's no halacha and there's no requirement of asiyah with regard to Lulav because we don't derive Lulav from Sukkah. If we don't derive Lulav from Sukkah, the entire enterprise, the psul, which is called Tas and Lomin Asli, has no application to Lulav. So then we're back to square one. So what are they arguing? What is the machlok? So whether I can pluck out and remove the black colored berries, My laba mifligim. The man, the apostle Rabbi Lezer, who's machmir, savar amrinon yeshti creates mitzvahs. That means that the moment he put together his three minim, and now he's got a das that's full of berries, it's possible. And once it's possible, we apply the principle of dichli, which we derive from kach. Uman de machshir, but the chachamim say, lo amrinon yeshti creates mitzvahs. That's a separate halacha in kodshim, and we don't extend it to apply it to mitzvahs. And there's a very, very important Rashi here, but again, just don't know how to time myself. That's my biggest challenge. If you look at the wide lines in Rashi, or the next to the last word before the one, Bi'afagav, the lo nira v'nidchu eladichu mei kara. Okay, so there's a concept called dichu mei kara. Dichu mei kara means that there was no moment in time when the object of the mitzvah was kosher. It was always nidche. It was possible from its birth, so to speak. Now, Rabbi say, where do you think there's more of a reason to say dichui, which means once it's disqualified, you cannot qualify? In the following two scenarios: in dichui mei kara, where it was never kosher, or in a case where it was kosher and then there was dichui. Which of those two is more inclined towards yesh dichui? That once it's disqualified, it's always disqualified.
No. It was kosher, then it became
excellent, beautiful. I was thinking you're going to fall into my trap, but you didn't fall into my trap. Rashi's pointing out that in the case where there are too many berries, that's called dichui mei kara. It was never kosher to begin with, and then you made it kosher. So that's not a big deal. The real big deal is when it was kosher, then it was nidche, and now you want to, after the dichui was out, you want to recreate a kashrus. That's the real issue. So that's Rashi's issue. So Rashi's saying that the only conclusion that we can derive here from Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok is yesh dichui mei kara eitzon. Oh, well, let me go the other way around. Sorry. We'll try the chachamim. The chachamim say ein dichui eitzon mitzvahs. Yeah. Rashi says ein dichui mei kara eitzon mitzvahs. But it could be that the chacham would agree that if you had a case where it was kosher and then it became possible, let's say you had adas that grew berries, but initially there were no berries. Initially, I mean on Yontiv. But on Yontiv itself, after you did the Agad, all of a sudden berries appeared. That would be an issue of Yesh Dichui, and even the Chachamim might agree in that case, Yesh Dichui. Again, Rav said this is an hour discussion that I gave you in 2 minutes. So you'll just have to let it fly. That's all, because that's what Daf Yomi is. So the Gemara says, "Lo, do kuli amo lo amrin and yesh dichui eitzon mitzvahs." Even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that there's no dichui eitzon mitzvahs. The problem is tasim v'lo min asu. Mar savar, according to Rabbi Eliezer, Tzadok yalfina lulav misukah, and even though the word tasa appears only with regard to sukkah, we, by process of transmutation, we apply it even to what? Even to lulav, and therefore we have a problem with tasalom and asu. You now remove the berries. You've got to start from scratch again, my friend, and recreate your hoshana. Marsava the chacham hol lo yalfina lulav mi sukkah. So there's no problem of tasim v'lo min asu, and therefore we can insist that everybody holds yesh dichui ein dichui some mitzvahs. Iboy seima isfir long lulav tzarich eged. The kuli ali alfinon lulav misuk. Everybody would agree that you could derive lulav from sukkah. But the machlokes here between the Chacham Rabbi Eliezer Reb Tzadok is hacham lulav tzarich eged kam mifliki. They're arguing whether or not lulav requires eged, and if lulav requires eged, which is going to be the shita Rabbi Eliezer, like Rabbi Yehuda, then we have a problem with Tasim Lobanasi when he plucks off the berries. Ubi plugged the Hani Tanoim, the Sanya, the Brisa records a Machlokas Tanoim about Eged. Lulav Bain, all good Bain Shein, all good Kasha. The Tanakama holds that there's no requirement of Eged. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, all good Kasha, Shein, all good possible. My time, Rabbi Yehuda, Yolif Lakicha Lakicha Agudas Ezo. Then in the case of Agudas Ezo, in the Parsha in Chukas of Paraduma, the Torah requires Eged. And there's a word that's common to both Agudas Ezov and Lulav. How so? Siv Hacha, in Lulav, it says Ula Kaftem. Please underline the word Ula Kaftem. Lochem Yom Rishon. Uksiv Hasav, and then the parsha of Agudas Ezov. Again, underline the word Ula Kaftem Agudas Ezov. Malhalan, just like in the case of Agudas Ezov. We require Aguda because the Torah calls it Aguda. That's not a political statement. It's Afkan Aguda. Here too, in Daled Minim, we require Aguda. Rabbanan less Lakicha Lakicha. This has to do with the nature of Gzeir Shavah. You have to have a Kabbalah for Yetza, for Gzeir Shavah. It's not something that you create. You can't take a computer and find two words. I mean, that's good for Drush, but not for Gzeir Shavah. Gzeir Shavah has to be going back all the way. So the Rabbanan never had this Gzeir Shavah. Therefore, they don't require Aguda. So don't talk to me about Tasa B'Lom and Asu. What do we do with the following price? The price says Lulav Mitzvah Yod. The Imlo Agdol Kosher. It's a nice mitzvah. Mani, I can't work this. Rabbi Yehuda, Kilo Agado, am I kosher? According to Rabbi Yehuda, the requirement of Eged is critical. It's indispensable. Rabbanan, my mitzvah card. Well, what do you tell me to do a mitzvah? Why a mitzvah? Who needs Eged? Or here's the Lola Rabbanu. You beautify the mitzvah by tying together these three meanings. That's called Hebrew.
So you don't have to do it.
Well, yes and no. In other words, the mitzvah is Zekeli Yaveyu. But if you didn't fulfill Zekeli Yaveyu, then you don't say the mitzvah. But you forfeit the Zekeli Yaveyu. You know what I mean? So this is a famous Akira where the Zekeli Yaveyu was part of the mitzvah, it's a separate mitzvah. The lulav. Imagine going into the shul, and there are 100 lulav. They range in price from 5 shekels to 500 shekels. I buy the one for 5 shekels. Yeah, it's not a very pretty lulav or es, whatever it is. So it's lacking Zekeli Yaveyu, but I fulfilled my mitzvah. I forfeit Zekeli Yaveyu. Later, the Mishnah says, Oshaya Novim Merubim. And the Mishnah says that if you have too many anovim, too many berries, then it's possible. Omer Rav Chizda, Dover Zer Rabbeinu Agadol Amaro. Rabbeinu Agadol is Rav. Rashi says that all of Shas in one exception. Anyway, Hamakom Yeh Ba'ozer may be blessed by a Kodesh Baruch Hu to the system, like Siyat and Shmaya. Lo Shanu Ela B'Makom Echad. If he's got a concentrated group of berries in one place on the hadas, it's possible. But if the berries are spread throughout the hadas in 2 or 3 places, it remains kosher.